Hey there.
Hello, Simon.
How you going?
I'm okay, and you?
Great, thank you. We've got similar backgrounds going on there. That works.
Yeah, that's louder.
How's that? You can hear me okay?
Yes, I can see. I can see my my library is matching yours. Look,
Yeah, it's not too
that's
far
fine.
off, right? Could almost be in the same place.
Great. So good
Yes.
morning.
What's that?
Good morning. It's
Yeah,
nighttime for you, for me, but it's morning for you, and it's tomorrow for you. That's really odd.
yeah, we live in the future down here. Welcome. Yeah. Hey, I'm excited about this because for me, you're someone who lives in a world of language that like sort of very few people get to live in, and so it's a great for me as a photographer who lives in a very much a visual world. This is very exciting, and um, having not read your bio before sort of recently, I'm now equally intimidated. So thank you. Um,
There's
I,
no need. Photography is also a language, so you do inhabit a world of other languages too.
yeah, thanks. It is. It does certainly feel more like my first language, photography, than my. Hey, I think what I'll do is I'll introduce you. Some people won't know who you are. You know, with that world domination, there'll be a few people left. So we'll do that, and then I'll kick straight into asking you some deep and meaningfuls, if that's okay. Um, well, Mariana Casale is an Argentine bilingual bibliotherapist and literary consultant based in the mighty Manchester in the United Kingdom. Um, Mariana holds a PhD in Latin American cultural studies from the University of Manchester and did her thesis on Jorge Luis Borges as a cultural icon, and you published that in 2014.
Yes.
You facilitate a number of reading groups focusing on classic and contemporary short fiction in English and Spanish, like one of those isn't hard enough. And you specialize in comparative literature and contemporary Latin American fiction. This is quite a lot. Um, but, because that's not enough. You bring together literature and mental health to help people find their own stories and the stories that they read and to support them in reauthoring their lives. That's significant. Congratulations on that endeavor. That's mighty. Very
Thank you.
cool.
That last bit is what I hope to do. I think that's what I hope
Yeah,
to do. That's my journey at the moment.
yeah. I'm sure you're modest as well, but that's okay. It's a conversation. Hey, so you've had some time with the questions. I'm going to ask my questions, but what I would invite all the viewers to do today is to, at some point, send in their question over the ticker tape. And what I'll do is I'll pick one out that I think is a really good question, and I'll ask that to you,
That,
sort of towards, and that person, I'll send a copy of my latest book, Right Fruit, wherever you are in the world. I'll pick that up and I'll send it to you. So there's a challenge for those people watching today. Um, but without further ado, because we've got an hour, less than that now, my first question is, how has your library come about? It's a pretty broad question, but I'm sure you'll answer it beautifully.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for that introduction. It was very generous. Um, I thought I'd start by telling you that I am in a part of my house that contains a library. In a way, I think I live inside a library because every room in my house, apart from one of the bathrooms and the utility room and the garden, of course, has books and bookshelves in it. So I'm downstairs with part of my library,
Hmm.
and it's difficult to answer that question without sort of giving you a bit of a history of how the books have come together, and it's been rather fragmentary. So bits here and bits there, different parts of my life have contained different bookshelves. And so in this house now, I think that all my past libraries coexist. And they also coexist with libraries that belong to other people, because I kind of look after books for people who have moved to other cities. And so there are books in this house that that have come from different origins. So it's not, it's not one library, it's many libraries in one. So I thought I'd just show you a little bit, and then we can go upstairs where my inner library is. Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely. That's fun. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna turn this around. You can see it's nighttime in Manchester. And that's, so this is the downstairs kind of living room, and there's lots of books there, lots of shelves, and over there. And then there's another room next door that I couldn't possibly show you because being on lockdown with 2 children and working full-time results in a lot of mess. So this is, in this part of the library, there's lots of children's books. And I wanted to take one out because I think we're going to talk about childhood books later. And I'm also going to find another book that was quite difficult to get, so I can tell you about it later. So, if you'd like to come with me, then we can go upstairs to the rest of the library. Would that be okay?
Perfect, thank you. Okay. How big is your house if you're taking on other libraries?
Well, you know, Borges, my favorite writer, used to say that paradise is a kind of library. So for him, paradise would be inhabiting a library. And I like to think that I live in a library, but it's not as big. It's just that when you live in a library, it seems bigger.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, all that potential and possibility, I imagine.
Quite, yeah. So now I'm sitting here in my favorite part of the world, which is my library, my inner library. This is my study where I work. So this is where all my most significant books are.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for opening up your inner library to us today.
Pleasure.
Very cool. And having that kind of background on, you know, the distinction between your library and the rest of the house and other people's books, that's quite amazing. I like that. There's lots of coming and going with the books. People are moving and then asking you to send them on. How does that work?
Well, there are books that belong to, so there's a friend in particular who she's moved to about 3 different cities so far. So she came once and she said, can I just leave my library with you, a part of my library, and you look after books, and as soon as I move into my new house, I'll come back and get them. And of course, this is about the 3rd city that she's moved to. I don't reckon she's going to be back for the books very soon. She was back last year and she said, oh, I can see that they're doing really well. And she just left them. And then there are books that I have brought from back home, from Argentina, in successive trips. So every time I come back from home, I bring books that used to be mine when I was a child or when I was at university, or new books that I buy over there. So it's a migrating thing.
Yeah, sure. That's very cool. Because traveling with books isn't that easy, right? The weight's just
no, that's true.
So the oldest, maybe the first purchase you made, what book have you got to show us?
I don't know. I thought about that a lot, and I can't remember exactly which my first purchase was, but I wanted to show you something that's very old, and that's around here. Yes. And I don't know if it's the first one I bought, but it's certainly the first one. I do lots of interviews with writers, and that's an important part of my life. So this is certainly the first writer I have ever met. And this is 1988, so I was a baby. I'd just been born. No, I was really young. And so she was a writer who's now passed away, called Paul de Bird. So she's an Argentine writer, cuentos de amor, stories of love stories. And you know, she's like a teenage read. But this is important to me because it's the first book that was signed for me. Yeah. And the reason it's important, and it's the first book I remember actually getting for myself, is that I went up to her and I was very nervous, and you could ask her questions, of course, and I didn't know what to ask. So I said, what do I have to do to write? You know, how do you write? How do you become a writer? And she said, just write, just write. I thought she was going to come up with something really sort of sophisticated or difficult. And she just gave me probably the best advice about writing ever. Just do it, you know, just write. And that's why this book is significant. And, you know, it kind of, I suppose, takes the place of a first purchase, because it's a first acquiring of something important.
Yeah, I like that. That's fantastic.
Thank
and
you.
So she's since died, produced other books that you've got in your collection as well, I imagine.
This author?
Yeah.
No, this is the only one that I have by her. So in fact, she became really important because of the advice that she gave me. And then, of course, I could, you know, my reading evolved from there, because this is kind of a you know, a teenage read, which is important in that way. But then, you know, other things happened.
Yeah. And any of your children have read that since?
Oh, no, not this one. My children don't read Spanish very well, I'm afraid.
Right. Okay. Cool. And so,
I have a childhood book, though, to show you. Do you want to see a childhood book?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
This one is really, this one is older than that one, but I didn't buy it myself. That's one. It's called, people in Argentina will recognize it. This is Dailanquiqui by Maria Elena Walsh. This book is important to me because it was read to me aloud by my kindergarten teacher. So she used to sit us all down on the floor, and we would have a time in the day after, I think it was after our snack, and she would kind of darken the room, and everything would go quiet, and she'd just sit and read. And this is, you know, this is a very, Maria Elena Walsh is an important author in Argentina. She wrote children's books and songs and many other things. And then, of course, as I grew older, I realized and I learned that she was very politically involved as well. So she was an inspiration in many ways. And this book is also beautifully illustrated, quite surreal. It's about an elephant, in fact. Yeah. It's a bit odd.
See some of the illustrations inside, is that okay?
Say again, sorry?
Can we see some of the illustrations inside?
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, look at how a chapter begins.
Oh, wow.
It's just beautiful. And I'll show you some of all the chapters begin like that. Oh, look.
Wow, that's great.
It is. And of course, this book also kind of migrated because it went to my cousins. And so when I had my first child, my auntie gave it back to me with a dedication there.
Wow, that's quite some dedication, and beautifully stylized onto the page. That looks great.
Thank you.
Love that. That's cool. So would that be the most precious book on your bookshelf, do you think?
No, it is precious, but I have two books that are particularly precious, and I've been kind of itching to show you because they are important in many different ways. There are two, and I'm going to put some gloves on because they're very old and they're very precious. One of them is El Aleph. Oh, can you see it?
Yeah.
So this is a book by Borges, and
Uh-huh.
it's a first edition.
Wow.
And it was given to me by my parents when I finished my PhD. That was my present, my graduation present. It's very, very precious. I mean, it's just, you can see,
Yeah.
if you could smell this book, you would not believe it.
Yeah,
Oh,
I often how
beautiful.
it smells first, right? What period was that published in?
That was published in 1949, I think.
Right.
And then my sister, also for my graduation, gave me another book by Borges, signed. That's
Get out.
Borges' autograph.
That's quite an autograph, isn't it? Look at that.
You know,
It's like,
can you imagine why it's so confused and so illegible?
yeah, it's very electrical. I love that.
Yeah, that's because Borges was blind.
Really?
Yes.
I had no idea. That's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yes, it is incredible. He went blind at the age of, completely blind at the age of 55 when he was
Mm,
made director of the National Library in Argentina. So it's the greatest irony ever.
really?
Yeah.
Having been and then become blind, that's quite a journey.
Yeah, there's a very famous photograph of Borges that taken by Diane Arbus in Central Park. And it's a very significant photograph because it's the only photograph that was taken, well, not the only one, but yes, the most striking photograph taken of Borges, where he appears to be looking at the camera. But of course, he's not really looking, he can't see anything because it's in the 60s. So he was 69, I think. And so he'd already been blind for a long time. And he's standing in Central Park in the middle of, it looks like a deserted environment. And he's standing there with his walking stick. And it's a very unflattering photograph, but it says a lot about photographing the blind, which is a really interesting game of masks, because people who are blind can't see that you're looking at them. And so it's a very interesting game that, and a very bold thing that Diane Arbus did, which, you know, as we know, that's what she did. So anyway, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, wow, that's beautiful. I love that. So what would you say the books are in your library that have probably had the most profound influence on you? And still, you know, I guess there's that influence for me, and I know with my books it collects over time, and time sort of proves that. It's like an alchemy almost, that I really love with mine. So what books do that for you?
Well, I suppose that there are books, I have different types of books, of course, and I suppose that partly there are theory books and sort of philosophy and criticism, books of criticism and theory and philosophy, that kind of thing, that had a deep influence in my life, because it took me, it was an interesting journey of how I came to understand those books. I found them very, very difficult at the beginning. And I had to, it's interesting you're talking about language at the beginning, where sometimes with sort of philosophy, criticism or theory, you have to almost learn a new language, is the specific kind of jargon that you use for those fields. So it was it was quite a long journey for me. And that kind of appreciation of theory grew alongside my reading of literature. And so it was important. And there's a shelf behind me, see if you can see actually. Because see that at the back above my desk, against the green wall. So those are some of my kind of theory books. And also there are lots of books there that that I used during my PhD to learn things that I knew nothing about. And so it was interesting. So lots of things that are very kind of visual, like comics and photography and cityscapes, space, lots of books about space and buildings and things like that. So those were books that allowed me to go on journeys that, you know, that felt quite bold, because they were into things that I knew nothing about. So that was important. And then there are, well, lots of fiction behind me, which is most of what I read. And a lot of the books that are on my shelves are books by authors that I spoke to. So those had a big impact on me, because I read them in order to prepare to interview them. And it was a journey into something that I knew nothing about. One of the most recent authors that I spoke to was somebody, a fascinating author called Paitim Statopchi, who is, let me show you, I've got a couple here. So, so he's from Kosovo originally, but he lives in Finland. So that's really, it's this book called Crossing. That was fascinating. So lots about identity. So Crossing is about crossing all sorts of boundaries, gender identity, national identity, you know. Wow. So anyway.
So great cover. Oh, that cover art's really striking.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it does play with the with, you know, the first thing that evokes, of course, is a very kind of nationalistic kind of symbol, isn't it? But then he develops the animals, and you know, there's a lot of magic in his books, and there's a lot of folk tales and stories, you know, passed down with the generations, and sort of this migrating of stories and migrating of land. So anyway, and he's lovely also, Paiti.
Beautiful. Is that in Spanish, or is that in English, that one?
Those are English translations of the original Finnish.
Finnish, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So what intrigued me about what you've just said was that you have these broader influences and you bring them into your writing, which is fascinating, because for me, you know, my library, and I'm sure it's similar to other people's, is that I love how those broader influences connect so beautifully. You know, for me, it's other writers like poets, sculptors, filmmakers. You know, broad and tangential, and the broader for me, the better. So you have lots of those broader influences. What would be the broadest or most strange or least obvious, do you think?
Oh, I don't know, least obvious. I think that it's a combination, as you say, that's the least obvious. So for example, I'll bring together writers who write in different languages, but also who write in different times and belong in different generations. And so I'll use those stories combined with my clients, so that we can have a more a more eclectic experience of literature, and we can feel how all of us are crossing borders all the time, and how at the same time certain themes are universal, and also at the same time how each of us has their own voice and their own style, and that includes us. So for me, the idea of us as co-writers is really important. So there's what's in the book, but also the magic, the alchemy happens when you read, because you become the co-writer. What you read in the story that you're reading, in the book that you're reading, is always going to be a way of writing yourself, if that makes sense. So this I work with short stories mostly, and so some of these shelves are just full of short story collections, and there are lots of short story collections by women writers of different cultures, and that's really quite fascinating. There are a lot of women who work with things, with ideas of strangeness and this sinister or macabre, or sort of today we're reading somebody who writes from or sort of drinks from a tradition of the Gothic, but in a modern, quite political context. So that kind of crossing is important. So it's a crossing of genre and a crossing of culture and a crossing of languages. One of the things that I love the most is this book by Beckett. So it's not surprising, but anybody who knows me knows that I'm kind of mad about Beckett. And what I like about him is this book in particular. So Beckett was a playwright, so we know that, apart from other things, but this book is a book of short stories, but it's the complete short prose. And you find all sorts of very strange texts in there, and it's very difficult to know whether it's a story or whether it's a poem or whether it's just I don't know, an essay. They're very strange. And the one thing with Beckett is that he used to say, particularly about his plays, that you're supposed to absorb the words with your body, with your nerve endings. So you're supposed to just relax your rational mind and let your body absorb the meaning. And when you do that, it's extraordinary, because it's very, the impact of the words on your body are very noticeable and very significant, and it goes really deep. There's another writer who does that, more contemporary, who's called Amy McBride. Let's see if you can see her name.
Got it.
She's an Irish writer.
Mm-hmm.
This is her latest book. It's called Strange Hotel.
Great title.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, look at that.
Wow.
Suddenly you have, block of text and then a list of cities. You can't stop to draw breath, because the writing just carries you, and it's very raw. So it really kind of hooks onto stuff that goes beyond your rational mind, if that makes sense. Anyway.
Very sensory, and the awareness of the body to do that's very must be very felt and very sensory. Do you find that with your own writing?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a shy writer myself. So I do a lot of when I write very small fragments. And yes, I suppose that it is like that. It's bursts of sensation, I think. Yeah. Yeah, I think now you ask me that, I think that's what it's like. Yes.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I imagine you dictating the pace of things, slowing things down, speeding things up, which is very similar to photography in the picture story sense, or in creating the photo books that I make. That you're gently guiding the viewer, suggesting ways to move, to feel. Yeah, it's great. Lots of similarities.
I mean, you can really tell with books made with images that that's really interesting, isn't it? That you're kind of drawn by a thrust that's invisible, but it's present. So you can really feel that that there is a thread drawing you on. But
Fantastic. I thought I'd mention, for those who didn't join us until a little bit later, that your questions are invited. In fact, what I'm going to do is draw one of those questions out, and I'll read that out. Ask Mariana that question, and that person will receive a copy of one of my books, Right Fruit. I'll send that to anywhere in the world. Just the best question needs to be asked. There you go. Mariana's got it. That's her own copy. She's not giving that away.
No, 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 that's mine. I'm not giving this to anyone at all.
And
This
so,
was
yeah, you're welcome. I'll pick one out. What Mariana's going to do at the end as well, after we're finished, is she'll take photos of a selection of the books that she's referenced today, and she'll post those to her live feed. So don't feel like you've missed out. Lots of the books that we've talked about today will be posted to Mariana's story. You just have to follow her. That's the only trick. Mariana, my next question, who are your favorite non-fiction authors?
non-fiction. Oh my
Yeah.
God, that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
Non-fiction. There's someone that I really like, who passed away a couple of years ago, who is he was a fiction writer, but he was a critic as well, and he was an incredible teacher. You know, he was a lecturer at university. He was very famous and very influential, and he was an expert on Borges as well. And I really admired him because he was very, you know, people who are very inspirational and they speak in a way that that kind of includes you. So he was wonderful, and he's called Ricardo Piglia. Here, okay, you can see that. Ricardo Piglia. He was an important person, an important personality in Argentine intelligentsia, and I really admired him. I'm a very, obviously I like reading print, but I'm a very kind of audiovisual person, so I really enjoy listening to people, and I learn best when I'm listening and when I'm speaking. Maybe surprisingly more than reading. So Piglia was very inspiring because he was a very good, he was very articulate and very generous with his teaching. So yeah, so I admire him. That's he comes to mind. Yeah, and this maybe because of course he wrote lots of books of criticism, and that I really like, but this one in particular, that's the one that I picked out from downstairs. This is it's called Argentina in Pieces, and it's a collection of comics that that reimagine literary pieces, you know, pieces of literature, but they're in a comic format. This one is of a very famous writer. Well, he was from Uruguay, I think, but he's in the Argentine canon, and that's Horacio Quiroga. He was a naturalist writer, and so Piglia got these pieces together, and he asked, again, you know, crossing all these boundaries, he asked comic strip writers and illustrators to make these stories into comic strips, and then he wrote introductions to, you know, little kind of pieces of criticism to introduce these. So that's what I really admired about him, that he was, you know, very, I don't know, creative with the way he did his non-fiction, I suppose. You know, ways of transmitting, you know, more theoretical stuff, but in a very accessible way. Anyway, yes, cool. Sorry.
Nice. Getting caught up in that. I can see you drifting off into another thought realm there.
You have to stop me, because otherwise I'll go on forever.
All right, we're all going down the rabbit hole with you. I'll ask this question now because it's actually a really good one, and thanks AJ for sending this in. AJ asks, how does the language you read in affect your experience or how you remember the work?
Ah, that's a really good question. majorly would be the short answer.
Mm.
So the language I read in is very significant in my reading experience. It's not. I read a lot in translation, and there are lots of texts that I read in both languages, because then I share them with people in either language. And translation is an instance of writing. So it's when you translate it, it becomes a different version of the text, and so you remember the story differently. Because again, what is different from one language to the other is perceived with your nerve endings. It's a more kind of sensory experience. So you relate to the text on a more sort of sensory level. Yeah. There's someone in particular that a contemporary Argentine writer whom I really admire, and she's a friend of mine as well. She's called Ariana Harwicks, and she wrote a trilogy that is very disturbing. So it's very raw, similar to Emery McBride that I mentioned before. And she came to Manchester the year before, and so we did an in conversation together, and she and I interpreted for her, as well as interviewing her. So we were doing we had two languages at the same time, and as she was speaking, she speaks the way she writes, and it's very raw and very gushing, and I had to interpret, but she wouldn't stop. So I had to sort of try to catch up with her. And I remember feeling at a certain point that I was kind of levitating, because it was, I was so engaged in trying to catch up with her that there were times where I forgot what language I was speaking, but I was very aware all the time that each of these versions of her books that I had read were different. They're the same story, but a different experience.
Wow, that's so cool. What a great experience. Love that. And do you think you were changing languages when you were translating? Like, I mean, was you were quite lost in it, obviously, you mentioned at the time.
Well, I think that there comes a point where you don't realize you're doing it. You just get on with it, and you just don't. It's very strange, but you just go, because you really haven't got much time to process it rationally. Sure. So you're using, your language skills in a way they come from those nerve endings that you don't have a lot of time to rationalize it.
Very good.
I don't know how it happens.
No, sure. Well, with great talent, I'm sure. AJ, great question. So thank you for that, mate. Get in touch with me after, DM me your details, and I'll get that book off to you. It's a really great question. Thank you.
Oh, lucky.
Now I'm curious, what have you got by your bedside right now that you're reading, and what's the kind of process for that, or the ritual and routine behind it? Because there's always a story, and I'm interested in those stories.
That's a good question. The thing is that because I read stories for work, that's what I do for work. I'm very lucky, because that's what I do for work. There are different types of reading. There's reading to prepare for work, and so I do that thinking of the people that I'm going to read with. And that's a more structured type of reading that I do at my desk, or I do sitting up. So I can't read that in bed. And then there's reading for pleasure. I derive a lot of pleasure from my work. I'm very lucky. But then there's reading that doesn't entail the responsibility of having to think of the people that you work with, or having to read with a pencil in hand. And so that's what I read in bed. And at the moment, so I have a pile. It's always a hopeful pile, you see. So I think I'm gonna do all this. The biggest treat is this one, which is it's the third in Hilary Mantel's trilogy, The Mirror and the Light, and these are about. So this is about Thomas Cromwell, you know, during the reign of Henry VIII and his wives, and you know, this is the third in a trilogy. So in the previous book, Anne Boleyn has just been beheaded. So this is the next one. So I'm really looking forward to this one. I haven't started it yet; it's just arrived. And then I've got.
Oh, right. That's a very.
It's quite formidable to read in bed. It's not great. Anyway. And then I have one that I wouldn't have chosen to read because it wouldn't have been the kind of thing I would have chosen, but it was recommended by a good friend of mine who's a psychoanalyst. And it's The Power of Coincidence.
Huh.
Yeah, by Frank Joseph. And I was really intrigued because he mentioned it, so I'm going to read that as well. And then there's a novel called La Uruguaya by Pedro Mairal. This one is in Spanish. Yes. This, yeah. And then when I find it very difficult to concentrate, because I'm kind of jumpy, I'm all over the place, the way I deal with that is I read aloud.
To yourself?
No, well, yes, I used to read to myself, and now I just I record videos so that I feel that I'm not on my own, that reading is a dialogue, because reading is a kind of dialogue anyway. So it makes me feel that there's also always an exchange. There is always an exchange between you and the text, obviously, but it makes it feel more, I don't know, more like connection. And
you mentioned before how you process is better audibly than read, so that makes sense too, right?
Yes.
Which brings me to my next question: Do you digest a lot of audiobooks or podcasts? Do you listen to stories in the car? How does that go for you?
No, I don't actually. That's a really good question. I don't, because I find it difficult to concentrate. I do sometimes, but very occasionally listen to audiobooks. I'm easily distracted. So if I'm reading aloud and I'm recording my voice or I'm recording a video, then I can't go away. I can't stop. So that's kind of helps me to concentrate. Yeah, and I also don't read on screen. It's, for me, reading is a very physical activity.
Yeah, no Kindles or iPads going on for you.
No, not really. I download them and then I never read them.
Yeah, I'm the same. I tried an iPad for a while. I believe Kindles are a better type of screen, although I just really love, as you said, the tactility and the smell of books.
Yes.
The physical nature of the object is really important.
Yes.
For me. Yeah. So you mentioned when we first started out that you've got your own books and you've got other people's books whose libraries you're holding on to while they move around. So it's obviously organized that way, so you know whose books they are and your own. Is there any other sort of method or madness to how you've organized your library?
Yes, there's more madness than method. In fact, there are, maybe I can show you, let's see, here, because this is where I work. There's a certain logic to it. So I'll turn around and you can see there that's my poetry library. There's poetry books there. That's Spanish poetry and then English poetry. So yeah, and then there's here, those are short stories by women writers, and those are my favorite. So you know, they're and the line of my eyes, so they're always visible. And
heavily
then
animated as well. There's lots of bookmarks in there.
yeah. So there's Lucia Berlin, Sarah Hall, Samantha Schweblin, my favorite. I adore her. She's lovely and she's an excellent writer. Ali Smith, of course. My Margaret Atwoods. Yeah, I mean, and the old. I really like the writers of the American Gothic. So where are they? So yeah, Karen Blixen, Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor, Eudora Welty. Yeah, and then there's some English fiction up there. And I've got, yeah, and then Spanish fiction, mostly Latin American. There's what's that? Yes, that's yeah, Spanish fiction, Spanish short stories, lots and lots of Spanish short stories, and then lots of Borges and some journals, some more Borges over there. Yes, I sometimes decide when I have a kind of a, when I'm working on masculinities, which is something that I do a lot, sort of interrogating masculinities, I suddenly decide that I want all the male short story writers to go on the bottom shelf, and then I put them on the bottom shelf and put all the women at the top, and things like that. But my library migrates a lot because I use the books a lot. My books are alive. They're not dusty because they move all the time. They move around, and I open them up and I write on them. They're very, you know, they're live things. They're not sacred things, even though they're important to me. They're not. There's no sacredness about them.
I love that. Yeah, I'm not sure of anyone who moves books around their library with frequency like you. Obviously, there's like a breathing, living organism in there.
Yeah.
So you mentioned when you were working on masculinity that you moved all the male authors to the bottom shelf. What was the rationale behind that? Well, why the bottom shelf?
Well, I think that this is because I've been reading. We've been reading a book by Haruki Murakami, which is called Men Without Women.
Yeah.
And it's a collection of short stories. And I sometimes become really cross with Murakami because he can be a little bit sexist. And so he annoys me. And so I put him on the bottom shelf, and I've changed it today, but I don't know where it's gone. I think it's gone up. And yeah, there it is. So he's Murakami. So Men Without Women is one that we're reading now.
Yeah.
And we have been reading this one together with Hemingway, of course, because Hemingway also had a collection called Men Without Women.
Oh, I didn't realize. Huh.
Yeah, so they were written, I don't know, 60 years apart, say. And so they're quite different. They're all short stories, but the different ways of writing about women through very male-centered stories. And so that's quite interesting, because then I also work with constructions of masculinity in Latin American fiction, particularly short stories that deal with how identity is constructed after dictatorship. So ideas of violence and asserting power in a very male way, and things like that. There's an author called Mariano Quiros, who's from Argentina, who is brilliant at revising these ideas of masculinity. So all that is here in my library, and so it migrates according to how they rise in my estimation.
I love that. That's really fascinating. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I just want to, is that according to your clock as well? Am I right?
I actually think we've got 11 minutes left before it's off.
Thank you. I'll try and get in a few more questions, but I don't want us to be cut off, which is what Instagram does after mid-sentence. So I'll try and wrap it up before we have that happen. A question I'm dying to ask is, sometimes we only know a person by the book made about them. Like, well, we'll never meet them, and that's often the case, right? So, what would be the most defining person you've never met, except through your book?
Well, that'd be Borges.
Yeah.
That'd be Borges, because I spent many years researching the books written about him, and so I had a chance to explore how he had been constructed through what had been written about him. So you have to decide whether you are going to know a writer particularly by his work, or you're going to know him through what has been done about him. And of course, you can't grasp a person that you haven't met. There's no way. So this mystery, and he's probably the most defining one. Yes.
Yeah, and of course he became your thesis and subject
Yes.
in 2014. Is there anyone that sort of has the potential to creep up on him in terms of that significant influence that you've been studying
That I haven't met?
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't think of the top. I suppose, yeah. Yes, Lucia Berlin, for example, who was a woman writer. So she died a few years ago, but quite a few years ago, and she was a very enigmatic, but not enigmatic. We know a lot about her, but she's made up of lots of fragments. Her life is made up of lots of different, contradictory at times fragments. So it would have been really interesting to have known, what she was like. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that curiosity gets piqued, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Level of intrigue.
Yeah.
I've got some different questions here. I just want to pick out the ones that are the most relevant, I think. Is there a book that was probably the most difficult for you to procure? Like there was some sort of challenge involved, or it feels like it was a hard one. What book would that be?
Yeah, that's it's a comic. It's a comic that was written. So it's a version of a very famous Borges story called El Fin. Oh, it smells really old. This was very, very difficult to get.
Wow.
This
I
kind
think,
of thing. Sorry?
My previous guest, Jeremy Hansen, will be very intrigued by this. He's a big comic fan, and I know he's listening. So, Jeremy, there's a challenge for you to try and find a copy of that.
It was very difficult. I actually didn't. It was, yeah, and it was really difficult to reference because it was done in a way that's very difficult to reference. So.
And what made it so difficult to get? Did you have to smuggle it out of Argentina?
Well, yes, because one of the artists that who produced this comic was disappeared by the dictatorship, murdered by the dictatorship. So, and the way they interpreted one of the Borges' story was so that the people were not ready for that rewriting. The political climate wasn't ready at the time.
All right. There's been a lot of upheaval, and as we all know, in Argentine history, so that's a significant part.
Yes, people particularly, artists and intellectuals. Yeah.
Hey, what should be? I mean, this is a difficult question for you to answer, I'm sure, but I've given you time to think about it because you've already had these questions in front of you. What would be the book you wish you'd written?
I wish I'd written like Ellie Williams. Ellie Williams. She like Deborah Levy. They're kind of writers who write in poetry. They write prose in a very lyrical and clever way. And when they write, they're writing about language and they're writing about their relationship with language and they're getting underneath the words. It's astonishing. Another one is Ali Smith. So she's got a novel called How to Be Both. I wish I'd written that. Yes.
Wow. Well, we all need something to aspire to, right?
Quite.
Do you subscribe to any journals? Like, you know, I've subscribed to the Paris Review for a long time now, and it just like, for me, the object is beautiful. It smells right. The size is perfect, and it's like Christmas for me every time it turns up. Do you have any subscriptions you have?
I used to. I don't anymore because that would be one thing. So I like to sort of draw from different sources. I've got some very old journals because I wrote about those before for my MA. And so I have copies from the 1930s that were also difficult to procure, and those were fascinating as objects as well. Yes, but I don't subscribe anymore to anything.
Were they Argentinian or were they English?
Yes, Argentinian, and some of them were African, but those I don't have them. I used a Commonwealth Library in London. There were journals from the 1930s. I think that we have 2 minutes.
Okay.
1:55.
There we go. We should wrap it up. Do you remember the name of the African journal? Just curious now.
Présence africaine.
Uh-huh.
Présence africaine. It was done in Paris.
That can still be found?
In the library, yes.
In the library. Okay. Awesome. That's so great. Hey, we could go on for easily another hour, I imagine. This was delightful and so great to get a sneak peek into your library and how it works and some of the stories behind it. So thank you so much, Mariana. Really,
thank you so much. I had a really good time.
Yeah, me too. And I know the viewers will be really intrigued to see some of these on your Instagram story later. So I'm sure they'll delve in.
I'll post them.
That. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
And you too. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye
Thank
for now.
you.